I lied to Watson. Not once, not as a slip of the tongue or a half-truth I regretted by morning. I looked at the man who had stood beside me through every dark place I had ever entered, and I told him deliberately that he could not help me, that I did not want him there, that he should go. And he believed me. What he did not know, what I could not let him know, was that there was a man coming to this room who had already killed once. And Watson, if he had stayed, would almost certainly have been next. I lied to save his life, and it nearly broke something between us that had never broken before. This is how it happened. This is my diary. These are my case notes. And I am going to tell you what I did and why I did it and what it cost both of us. Sit with me. It began with a box, a small ivory box, barely the size of a man's fist, decorated with an intricate carving, heavy for its size. It arrived at Baker Street on the 14th of October, 1895. No accompanying note, no return address. I did not open it immediately. I have, over the years, developed a particular caution about objects that arrive without explanation, especially when I have been following a particular trail of evidence for the better part of 3 weeks. Especially when that trail leads to a man named Culverton Smith. I set the box on the mantelpiece. I sat in my chair. I thought. Culverton Smith was not a man with a criminal history. He had no record. He had not, as far as the law was concerned, done a single thing wrong in his 50-odd years of life. He had made his fortune in Sumatra, plantations, a successful man, respected in certain circles, known in London as a figure of some learning. He had published, in a minor capacity, on the subject of tropical disease, specifically on a disease native to the Sumatra region, a disease with no recorded treatment, a disease that moved slowly, quietly through the human body until the body could no longer maintain itself. 2 months earlier, his nephew, Victor Savage, had died of that disease. I had reason to believe Victor Savage had been murdered, and I had reason to believe the box on my mantelpiece contained the mechanism of that murder. I did not touch it again that evening. Instead, I thought very carefully about what Culverton Smith was. He was not a man who could be frightened into confession. He was not a man who would panic under pressure. He had spent 30 years in a country where the law was distant and loose, and he had learned in that time to feel entirely comfortable making decisions that most civilized men would find unconscionable. He was patient. He was precise. He was, in his own way, a methodical man. He would only confess if he was absolutely certain he had already won. And so I needed to give him exactly that. I needed to make him believe he had already won. I sat by the cold fireplace for a long time that night, and I began to plan. I ate nothing for 3 days. That was the first requirement. The human body denied food for 3 days begins to show it. The face becomes pallid. The eyes take on a particular flatness. The skin loses its color by degrees, replacing it with something closer to ash. The hands, and this is important, the hands develop a faint tremor. I know this because I observed it in myself, methodically, using the mirror in my bedroom, checking the progression every 12 hours. By the evening of the third day, I looked convincingly unwell. I looked, in fact, as though I might be dying. I also applied with some care a preparation of beeswax and chalk to the skin of the face, a technique I had developed over many years for exactly this kind of work. It has no dramatic effect on its own, but combined with genuine pallor, genuine sunken eyes, genuine unsteadiness, it becomes invisible, indistinguishable from illness itself. Mrs. Hudson was informed of the plan in broad terms only. She was told to refuse all callers except Watson. She was told to appear distressed when Watson arrived. She is a woman of considerable composure and considerable loyalty, and she executed her role with no theatrics whatsoever. I arranged with Inspector Morton, a capable, discreet man, to be concealed in my rooms at the necessary moment. And then I took to my bed, and I waited for Watson. He came on the evening of the third day. Mrs. Hudson had sent for him. I heard his footsteps on the stairs. I knew them. I have always known Watson's footstep. There is a particular rhythm to it. A soldier's rhythm, left over from Afghanistan, with a slight drag on the right side where the wound still troubles him in cold weather. That evening, on those stairs, his step was faster than usual. He was frightened. That was the moment I almost stopped. I want to record that clearly here in these notes, in case anyone reading them believes this was easy. It was not easy. Watson entered the room, and I looked at his face, and I saw everything in it. I saw 17 years of friendship. I saw the man who had sat beside me through Irene Adler, and the Baskervilles, and the Reichenbach Falls, and every dark valley in between. I saw someone who was looking at me with a fear that was specific and immediate. Not the generalized anxiety of a man who has heard bad news, but the sharp, focused fear of a doctor who suspects he already knows what he is looking at. And I told him to go away. I told him I did not want a doctor. I told him the disease was beyond his abilities. I told him, and this was the cruelest thing, because it was designed to wound him precisely enough to make him leave, that his interference would do nothing except worsen my chances. I told him there was only one man in London who understood this disease well enough to help me. Culverton Smith. I told him I needed Watson to fetch Culverton Smith. Watson stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me. He did not argue with the diagnosis. He is too good a doctor for that, and the evidence in front of him pointed to something beyond his experience. He accepted it. He was shapen, but he was rational. But he did not want to leave. I could see that. He wanted to stay. He wanted to examine me himself. He wanted to do something. Because Watson, when those he cares for are in danger, is constitutionally incapable of inaction. I pushed him harder. I told him his presence was agitating me. I told him that excitement was dangerous to my condition. I told him I would be better, significantly better, if I knew he was on his way to fetch Smith, rather than standing in my room being useless. That word, useless. I watched it land. I am not proud of it. But he went. The door closed, and I lay in that bed, in the silent room, staring at the ceiling, and I thought about what I had just done to the man who trusted me more than anyone else in my life. I did not enjoy it. Let the record show that. I need to explain this, not to justify it. Justification is too comfortable a word for what I did, but to explain it. Culverton Smith was a man who had already murdered once. Victor Savage had died of a disease delivered through a mechanism so subtle that no doctor who examined him would ever have identified it as anything other than natural causes. The ivory box on my mantelpiece was the same mechanism. A small spring inside the box, coiled tightly, connected to a needle. The needle was coated. When the box was opened by someone unfamiliar with its construction, the spring released. The needle pricked the finger. The disease entered the bloodstream. Smith had sent me that box. He knew I was investigating. He wanted me dead, and he wanted my death to look like illness. He wanted it to look exactly like what had happened to Victor Savage. Now, I had not opened the box. I was not ill. The plan had not succeeded. But here is the calculation I made lying in that bed in those early hours before Watson arrived. If Watson were present when Smith came, if Watson were in that room observing, alert, with his medical instincts and his soldier's protective instincts both active at once, Smith would know immediately that the trap was for him. A man like Culverton Smith does not confess in front of witnesses who are clearly hostile. He does not confess in front of a former army doctor standing at the foot of a bed with his jaw set and his arms crossed. He confesses only when he believes he is alone with his victim, when he believes he has won, when he believes the man in the bed is truly dying, and that no one present understands what is actually happening. Watson's presence would have destroyed the trap entirely. And more than that, if Watson had known what I was planning, if he had been told, even briefly, that there was a man coming who had already murdered once using a mechanism of disease, Watson would not have left the room, not for any reason. He would have planted himself between me and that door and defied the entire plan. That is who Watson is, and that is why I could not tell him. He was safest not knowing. He was safest out of that room. He was safest fetching Culverton Smith in good faith, because a man arriving to gloat over a dying enemy does not feel the need to bring a weapon. I protected Watson by making him believe he was useless. That is the truth of it. And it is, I think, the most difficult thing I have ever done. Morton was in position behind the head of the bed, concealed in the darkness of the far alcove. He had been there for 2 hours. He is a patient man and a quiet one, and I trusted him to stay exactly where he was. I arranged myself in the bed with some care. The lamp was turned very low. The room was warm, I had ensured that, because warmth deepens the appearance of fever. I had loosened my collar. I had not moved my arms in several hours, so they lay at my sides in the correct stillness of illness. I was, in every visible detail, a dying man. I waited. Below, on Baker Street, I could hear the city, the clatter of a cab, a vendor's call somewhere in the distance, a dog, briefly, then silence again. I thought about Watson making his way across London in the dark to fetch a man he had no reason to distrust. Watson would have been direct. He would have explained simply that his friend was gravely ill, that no other physician could help, that Smith's expertise was urgently required. He would have been, because Watson is always earnest, entirely convincing. Smith would have come. Smith would have wanted to come. If you notice what others walk past, you think the way I do. Subscribe, the button is below. Now, back to Baker Street. Back to the low lamp and the still room and the trap that was waiting to close. He arrived at 9:30. I heard his voice in the hallway below, clipped, self-possessed, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in a room and being listened to. I heard Watson's voice in reply, quieter, strained. Then footsteps on the stairs, 2 sets. Smith entered first, Watson behind him. I had instructed Watson through Mrs. Hudson to wait outside the door once Smith was inside. I had told Mrs. Hudson to tell Watson that my specific instructions were that I wished to speak with Smith alone, that I would call if I needed him. Watson did not like this. I had anticipated that, but he obeyed. The door closed, and Culverton Smith stood at the foot of my bed. He was a lean man, 52 or 53, a face that had spent years in tropical sun and had developed, in response to that sun, a particular leathery quality. Not tanned exactly, but preserved. Dark eyes, perfectly controlled expression. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down. "I understand you have been asking about me," he said. I told him I had been. I told him I had been investigating the death of Victor Savage. I told him, and I delivered this with the particular flatness of a man who believes he is not going to be alive much longer, that I had reached certain conclusions. He listened. He did not interrupt. Then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has been shown a hand of cards by an opponent and found that the cards are, after all, not quite as strong as feared. He began to talk. I had counted on this. A man like Smith does not confess out of guilt. He has no guilt. He confesses out of pride. He had been careful for so long and so successfully that the impulse to let someone know, to let at least one person understand how clever he had been, was almost irresistible, especially when that someone was dying. Especially when that dying man had come close enough to the truth to be threatening. He talked about Victor Savage. He talked about the ivory box and the mechanism. He talked about the specific disease, Tapanuli fever, he called it, and its properties and its progress, and why it left no trace that any English doctor would recognize. He talked about me. about how close I had come. Close, Mr. Holmes, he said, but not close enough. I looked at him from the pillow with what I hope appeared to be the dull resignation of a man who has accepted his circumstances. Closer than you think, I said, and I turned up the lamp. Morton stepped out of the alcove. Smith moved. One sharp, involuntary movement, the chair scraping back across the floor. And then he went very still. The stillness of a man who has just understood what has happened. Morton identified himself. Smith said nothing. He looked from Morton to me and back to Morton with an expression I can only describe as the expression of a man recalculating every decision he has made in the past several minutes. I sat up in the bed. I am aware that this must have been, from Smith's perspective, rather dramatic. The dying man rising. I told him that everything he had said in this room had been heard. I told him that a man does not leave the window open when he is gravely ill, but that I had arranged for the window to be positioned precisely so that two constables standing in the street below could hear every word with perfect clarity. This was, I should note, entirely true. Smith looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You were never ill." "No," I said, "I was not." He was arrested. Morton handled the matter with efficiency. The door opened, and Watson was there. Watson, who had been standing in that corridor for 40 minutes, listening to nothing, knowing nothing, having been kept deliberately and completely in the dark. He looked at me sitting upright in the bed. He looked at the color in my face, already returning, already different from the gray he had seen 3 days ago. He looked at Morton leading Smith toward the stairs. And then he looked back at me. I do not have a precise record of what his face showed in that moment. I have tried to write it down more than once in these notes, and I have not found words that satisfy me. What I can say is this: it was not anger, not at first. It was something quieter than anger. It was the look of a man who has just understood, all at once, the full shape of something he has been kept outside of. Watson came into the room and closed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of the floor and he looked at me. I told him what I have written here. Not in these words, not with this degree of order and reflection, but the substance of it, the plan, the reason for it, the ivory box, the spring and the needle, and the disease. Victor Savage, Smith's confession. I told him why I had sent him away. I told him that his presence would have made it impossible, that Smith would have sensed the hostility in him immediately, because Watson, when those he loves are in danger, is not a subtle man. He is a loyal man. He is a brave man. But he does not conceal his feelings easily. And Smith would have seen the trap in Watson's face before a single word was spoken. I told him that sending him away was the only way to protect him from a man who had already murdered once and would not have hesitated to do so again. Watson listened to all of this. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he asked me how long I had been planning it. I told him. 3 days without food, 2 hours of preparation before the first evening, the arrangement with Morton, the note to Mrs. Hudson. He was quiet again. Then he asked, in a tone of voice I have not forgotten, whether it had occurred to me to simply tell him. I said that it had occurred to me. He asked why I had not, and I gave him the answer I have already given in these pages, that his knowing would have ended the plan, that his nature, the very qualities that make him the man he is, would have made concealment impossible. Watson looked at the floor. Then he said, "You might have trusted me to try." I had no answer to that. He was right, and he knew it, and I knew it. And we both sat for a moment in the mutual understanding that there is a particular kind of hurt that comes not from being wronged, but from being protected in a way you were not asked about. I told him I was sorry. He looked at me. That direct, level look that Watson has when he is deciding how much he means something. And then he said, "I know you are." And then he told me I looked terrible and asked when I had last eaten. I told him 3 days ago. He left to find Mrs. Hudson, and I lay back against the pillow in the empty room, and I felt for the first time in 3 days something close to relief. He stood trial the following spring. The evidence was comprehensive. The confession, heard by Morton and the 2 constables in the street below, was the central matter. Smith's legal counsel argued, with considerable ingenuity, that a confession given to a man the speaker believed to be dying could not be considered voluntary. This argument was rejected. The mechanism of the ivory box was examined by 3 medical experts. Their testimony confirmed what I had already established. The spring, the needle, the coating of the needle, the disease it delivered. They confirmed also that this same mechanism, deployed in Victor Savage's rooms some months earlier, was consistent with Savage's symptoms and death. Smith was convicted. He did not speak during sentencing. He sat very still and said nothing, which is, I think, a kind of consistency. He had been a controlled man throughout. He remained one. Victor Savage was given, in the official record, the cause of death that was accurate. That matters. It is a small thing, perhaps, to those who did not know him, but it matters. I record cases because the cases are worth recording. The methods, the details, the sequence of observation and deduction. These things have value beyond the individual instance. They demonstrate a way of looking at the world that I believe has applications beyond crime and investigation. But this case I have recorded for a different reason. I have recorded it because it is honest in a way that most of my other records are not. In most of my cases, I am the one who sees everything. I am the one who assembles the truth from the fragments others overlooked. I am, in the structure of the story, the person who is right. In this case, I was also wrong. Not about Smith, not about the plan or the mechanism, or the deduction that led me to Tapanuli fever and the ivory box and the spring-loaded needle. On all of those matters, I was precise. But about Watson. Watson said, "You might have trusted me to try." And he was right. I had calculated, correctly, that his nature would have compromised the plan. I had also decided, without asking him, that his nature was more important to my plan than his willingness to try. That was not a deduction. That was a decision made on behalf of another person, without their knowledge or consent. And Watson, who has been a partner in this work for a very long time, and has proved himself more than once capable of things I did not anticipate, deserved better than to be managed like a variable in an equation. I do not think I would make a different choice if I faced the same situation again. That is the uncomfortable truth. The plan required what it required. The alternative, Watson knowing, Watson in that room, Watson unable to conceal from Smith's sharp eyes what he knew and felt, would have cost us the case, and might have cost Watson considerably more than that. But I think there is a difference between making the right choice and making it well. I made the right choice. I did not make it well. And Watson, who forgave me with the quiet efficiency of a man who has had long practice in forgiving me, deserved to hear me say that. So I said it. Here, in these notes, I say it again. People who study my methods tend to focus on observation, on the dust on the windowsill, on the watch that was wound, on the ash in the fireplace, on the mud on the carpet. They study the seeing. What they rarely ask about is what it costs to see clearly. To see clearly, you must remove everything that distorts the picture. Sentiment, assumption, the comfort of believing what is convenient rather than what is true. You must be willing to look at a thing, even a thing you love, and see it exactly as it is, rather than as you wish it were. I have done this my entire life. And in the autumn of 1895, lying in a bed with chalk on my face and 3 days of hunger behind me, I looked at what I was about to do to John Watson, and I saw it exactly as it was. I was going to cause him real pain. I was going to use his trust as a mechanism of my plan. I was going to weaponize his care for me. I saw all of that. And I did it anyway. Because the alternative was worse. Because Culverton Smith had already killed one man. And the case required closing. And there was no other way. And because this is the part that is hardest to write, I could not afford to lose Watson. Not in the room. Not in the sense of the plan, but in the larger sense. In the sense that matters more than any case. I could not afford for him to be in that room with a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill. I lied to protect him. That is what this case is, at its core. Not a deduction, not a triumph. A lie, told out of something that I am not given, by temperament or training, to name easily. But Watson knows what it was, and that is sufficient. These are my case records. If you have stayed with me this far, you have the patience and the mind for this kind of work. The next entry is already written. Subscribe to this casebook and I will show you another case, another room, another lie, another truth that only reveals itself to those who refuse to look away. Until then,